Okay, hello, welcome everybody. I think that's everyone who's come to the house to attend the lecture in situ. It's a pleasure to welcome so many familiar faces, some new faces, some very young faces too. Adorable. I will be speaking to you today. My name's Celine Lupo-MacDade. I'm the director and curator of the museum here today, and I've rather bravely/foolishly taken on the topic of Johnson and love, which we'll be talking about today. It is a huge topic, and we have half an hour, so this will be a dipping of the toe into the waters that is the subject of love, Johnson's understanding of that, Johnson's experience of that, and Johnson's very much definition of that. It's one of the wonderful things that we do in this house, the education programs of all ages. We bring around from preschool through to education of a third age. And of course, it's compulsory to come up with definitions for various things. And we start with simple things like, chair, table. More complicated things like animals, classifications of animals, from, a cat being of the leonine order, for example, or dogs being canines, into much more complicated things like colours. They're actually quite hard to define. And of course, then on the emotional spectrum, how do you define something like love, distinct from like or hate or dislike? But here we are. I'm going to first talk about Johnson's experience of love in his life very briefly. And love, as we know, comes in many, many forms, from the romantic to the platonic to the familial. And they're very much turn for inspiration to Johnson's dictionary, written in this very room. So I think it's fair to say Johnson's first experience of love starts with his mother at birth. So Sarah Ford, his mother, came from a middle class milling family in the Midlands. The daughter of Cornelius Ford. So of her description, locally in records, she's descended of an ancient race of substantial yeomanry in Warwickshire. They were well advanced in years when she married Johnson's father, Michael. He was 49 and she was 37. They then had two children, both sons, the eldest being Samuel, our Samuel Johnson, and his younger brother, Nathaniel. Sadly, he died when he was only 25, under circumstances not very well described, but he was unmarried and childless. So the line ends with both him and Samuel in terms of a direct lineage of children from Sarah and Michael Johnson. Johnson's mother must have been a fairly tolerant woman to a degree. I think Johnson was an extraordinary man, an extraordinary child, who by the age of around 2 had already learnt to read and write, was a voracious reader in his father's bookshop, and possibly a little precocious as a result. He certainly enjoyed reciting at no limit, really. But what he did really resent was his mother's tendency to roll him out as a bit of a party piece. A proud mother, no doubt, but he did resent having to perform on demand and recite various prayers or poems he may have read. She really did understand his acute intelligence. She was a woman of distinguished understanding, according to Boswell, who will have gathered this from Johnson himself, no doubt. When Boswell asked a school friend of Johnson's, when he was later compiling his great dictionary, The Life of Samuel Johnson, she asked if she was not vain of her son. And this little anecdote comes out. She said she had too much good sense to be vain, but she did know her son's value. Her piety was not inferior to her understanding, and it was Sarah who laid the very early impressions of religion upon the mind of Johnson, something that would follow him throughout his whole life, in his writing, in his personal life, from his prayers right through to the selection of citations included in the dictionary, which do have a moralistic undertone to a degree. Johnson once said of Sarah, his mother, that when he was a child in petticoats, so he was about 2 or 3 years old, he had already learnt to read. Mrs. Johnson one morning put the Common Prayer book into my hands, pointed to the collect of the day and said, "Sam, you must learn this by heart." She went upstairs, no doubt needing to do the laundry or some such task, leaving him to study it. But by the time she had reached the second floor, she heard him following her on the staircase. "What's the matter?" she said. "I can say it," said Johnson, and repeated it distinctly, word perfect, though he can't have had time to read it more than twice. Johnson said of his father, he was evidently subjected to Sarah's consciousness of her own superior social origins. This became a source of tension in the marriage in the Johnson household. Michael was not the most successful of booksellers, and the family, having gone from sort of a comfortable life, quite rapidly declined into debt. She seemed uninterested in books, apparently, and she can hardly have found an ideal companion in Michael. Later in life, her son very much respected her memory, but gave little sign that he enjoyed a warm or particularly loving relationship with his mother in all of the accounts that he retells to his various later biographers, including Boswell. Sarah Johnson died in 1759. Johnson was still living in this house at that time. The final act of writing that took place in this building, and indeed an act of love for his mother, was committed in this very room. His one and only novel, Rasselas, was written here over the course of about 5 days in order to pay for her funeral. It was at that point he gave up this building as being far too expensive to live in and moved to much smaller lodgings nearby, and he would never live in a house this size at this expense ever again. The next major woman to feature in Johnson's life is, of course, his wife. Now, sadly, very little remains of Elizabeth Jarvis, Tetty, as he would affectionately call her, because by the time she passed away, Johnson's success in the dictionary had not yet been cemented. He was still compiling it in this house. And so recollections come from faded memories and from second, third hand accounts. But what we do know is Elizabeth Jarvis was born on the 4th of February in 1689. She was the middle child of 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and the only daughter to reach adulthood. Tetty received her first inheritance in July 1708, so this is about a year or so before Johnson's even born. This was when her grandmother Elizabeth passed away and left Tetty all of her household goods, as well as her plate, her rings and her cash, so this is not an insignificant amount. Tetty also inherited half of the residue of her grandmother's estate. This constituted a large and very appealing dowry. On her 26th birthday in 1715, Tetty married Henry Porter. Now, he was a Birmingham textile merchant. They together would have 3 children, Lucy, Jarvis and Joseph. Henry was apparently not a particularly successful businessman, and Tetty had to settle quite a few debts of his upon his death in 1734. Now, Henry and Tetty became very good friends with the young Samuel Johnson in 1732. This is a couple of years before Henry passed away. Tetty was 43-year-old at this time, and Johnson was apparently something of a lanky, tall, slim, lanky 23-year-old. In relation to his appearance, his biographer Boswell detailed the facial scarring that he'd had from childhood scrofula, the gesticulations that he was prone to making without warning, that's later posthumously been diagnosed quite likely as Tourette's syndrome. But Boswell writes that Mrs. Porter was so much engaged by Johnson's conversation that she said to her daughter, "This is the most sensible man that I ever saw in my life." Now, if we turn to the dictionary to understand the significance of that choice of word sensible, you can see that it has the meaning that we use today of a very rational, logical person, but also retains some of the sentiment that it holds in the European languages still, such as sensitive. So he's a very sensitive but very rational, logical man. Basically, I think she was saying, and this is evidenced by Johnson's later work, that he had a profound capacity for insight into the human condition. And a lot of what he says, we were just saying this to one of our guests here today, 5 minutes before you sat down, it's universal, it's timeless. What he said then resonates to this day in such a way that it really encapsulates what it means to be a human, both the joy but very much the what's to be enjoyed but also to be very much endured. Perceiving by either mind or senses is the actual definition. Having moral perception, having the quality of being affected by moral good or ill, and having quick intellectual feeling, being easily or strongly affected. So any of these definitions really would suggest that, as Boswell recorded, she saw quickly beyond his physical conditions, beyond his rather lack of personal hygiene, perhaps, should we say, and admired that intelligence of his sensitive, moralistic nature. This is particularly interesting given that Johnson was really just a young man at this time, 23, and he's talking to a 43-year-old woman. Boswell echoes this through Garrick's reference to her later. David Garrick, the great Shakespearean actor and dear friend of Johnson and former pupil of his. Though Mrs. Porter was double the age of Johnson, he says, and her person and manner, as described to me by the late Mr. Garrick, were by no means pleasing to others, she must have had a superiority of understanding and talents, as she certainly inspired Johnson with more than ordinary passion. Johnson began courting Elizabeth soon after her husband's death in 34 and provided her with the affectionate name of Tetty or Tetsy on occasion. They were both quite regional contractions of Elizabeth. They married on 9th of July 1735, so this is but a year after Henry's passing, at St. Werburgh's Church in Derby when Johnson was just 25 and Tetty was 46. Neither Johnson nor the Porter families were particularly enthusiastic about this marriage. Tetty's two sons cut off contact with their mother as a result. But despite all this adversity, Johnson himself described the marriage as a love match on both sides. Certainly the dowry at this point, having paid off all the debts, was not enough to be a single motivator, I think. It was quite modest. Before moving to London, Johnson was attempting a career as a schoolmaster, having attended Pembroke College, but having to leave after only a year without graduating. Tetty's dowry was £600, and this was invested in setting up their own school at Edgile Hall. This is a private town, a private school just outside Lichfield. It was here that Johnson would meet the young David Garrick, a pupil at the school. Later, Garrick would tell tales of his classmates. He says, the young rogues used to listen at the door of Johnson's bedchamber and peep through the keyhole, these naughty little boys, that they might in turn ridicule his tumultuous and awkward fondness for Mrs. Johnson. So, Lord knows what they were looking at. Boswell stated later that Mr. Garrick described her to me as very fat, with a bosom of more than ordinary protuberance, swell cheeks, florid red, produced by thick painting and increased by the liberal use of cordials, flaring and fantastic in her dress, which sounds quite fabulous, and affected both in her speech and her general behaviour. I have seen Garrick exhibit her, by his exquisite talent of mimicry, as to excite the heartiest bursts of laughter. So he's probably just doing a bit of a parody of poor little Tetty. But he probably, as in the case of all such representations, is considerably aggravated the picture. So he's exaggerating a bit. But alas, no record of Tetty in her own words exists to counter these rather unflattering representations or any rebuttal that she might have against these young men. As I said, she was simply not famous nor Johnson at the time of her passing. Johnson moved to London in 1737 with Garrick, and Tetty joined him later that year. There are only a few anecdotes about their time together here, mainly supplied by Johnson's friend Hester Piozzi, another significant woman in his life, in her Anecdotes, published posthumously. Johnson recalled conversations with Tetty. She said, a clean floor is so comfortable, she would say sometimes by way of twitting, till at last I told her that I thought we had had enough talk about the floor. We would now have a touch at the ceiling. So, again, not beyond mimicking and teasing her a little bit himself. However, Tetty had a sense of humour too, apparently. Johnson's lectures on poverty and how they should be grateful for food may have become at times tiring, his moralising. On one occasion, she apparently interrupted him as he offered grace at the table as he would do daily. Nay, hold, Mr. Johnson, she said, and do not make a farce of thanking God for a dinner which in a few minutes you will protest is not eatable. So, at least a good sparring partner. However, there were periods where the couple were not always together. Unfortunately, one letter alone survives from their periods apart. From Johnson to Tetty dated 31st of January 1740. Johnson was in Leicestershire to apply for a schoolmaster's post, and Tetty is in London suffering from an injured tendon. The letter is available to view downstairs in reproduction if you're interested, on that first floor. But you can see really Johnson's sense of guilt in neglecting his wife. A genuine sense of affection comes through too. We also learn in this letter that Tetty's daughter, Lucy Porter, was actually at this point living with Johnson's mother in the bookshop up in Lichfield. Johnson says to Tetty, "Be assured, my dear girl, that I have seen nobody in these rambles upon which I have been forced that has not contributed to confirm my esteem and affection for thee, though that esteem and affection only contributed to increase my unhappiness when I reflected that the most amiable woman in the world was exposed by my means to miseries which I could not relieve." So he's feeling rather sorry for her current circumstances and just responsible for the discomfort in which she's finding herself in grubby, grimy London. Tetty suffered from quite a lot of ill health in her later years, and Johnson's friend, Dr. Robert Levitt, who lived here in the house at a later period, believed to have been exacerbated by alcohol and opiate medicines taken at the time. During the night of 17th of March 1752, she passed away at the age of 63. In the morning, Johnson wrote a letter to his dear friend, the Reverend Taylor. His portrait hangs just to my right above the staircase here, in which he expressed grief in the strongest manner he had ever read. This is Taylor speaking. So much so that it is much to be regretted that the letter has not been preserved. Taylor rushed over to this building here, Gough Square, to comfort Johnson, and found him, this is his words, in tears and extreme agitation. Boswell writes that Johnson's suffering upon the death of his wife were severe, beyond what are commonly endured. She's buried now in Bromley Parish Church, and Johnson wrote the Latin inscription to her on her tombstone, which translates to his beautiful, accomplished, clever, pious wife. Johnson kept her wedding ring in a box with him for the rest of his life, and is recorded as saying, "I have since my wife's death seemed to myself broken off from mankind, a kind of solitary wanderer in the wild of life, without any direction or fixed point of view, a gloomy gazer on the world to which I have little relation." Johnson expressed his grief in his literature and wrote a sermon on the anniversary of her death every year, and his funeral sermon for her was published after his death. It's actually available in our shop downstairs. His prayers and comments after her death also suggest that sense of regret and guilt that came through in the letter that we have. Tetty's final years took place during the time that Johnson was living and working here on his dictionary, and the success of this enormous project may have been overshadowed by her death. Johnson is recorded as saying about the publication of the dictionary, "I have protracted my work till most of those whom I wished to please have sunk into the grave." His sense of guilt is even more explicit in one of the Easter prayers that he wrote later. "May I obtain forgiveness of all the sins committed and of all the duties neglected in my union with the wife whom thou hast taken from me, from the neglect of joint devotion, patient exhortation and mild instruction." He would write to her a prayer to the day he died, how many years later? 30-odd years later, 32 years later. Turning to another significant woman who lived in this building at a later date. This is a dear friend of Johnson's named Anna Williams. Her portrait hangs downstairs. She was a friend of Johnson's and had undergone cataract surgery around the age of 29 or 30. Sadly, it was unsuccessful, and she was offered by Tetty a period of convalescence in this house. That was around the time that she passed away, shortly after. And Johnson had locked himself up in this building, was not receiving guests, was not going out. He was deteriorating quickly. Frances Barber arrives at this time, and later Anna Williams. He felt that he ought to respect his wife's wishes and invite her here to convalesce. Anna Williams herself was a poet, a translator from French into English of some note and talent, and she would actually end up living with Johnson here or in other accommodations or very close by in the same building or same street for the rest of her life. And she passed away only 6 months before Johnson himself in 1784. I'm often asked on tours if their relationship was ever romantic. I do not believe that there was any romantic relation Johnson had with anyone after the death of his wife, in part because of his grief, but in part because of his belief that the union with her was eternal. More complicated stories come in later, but with Anna Williams, there has never been anything to suggest it was other than a sort of an intellectual meeting of minds. And she, being a peevish woman with everyone around her, was the absolute epitome of patience with Johnson. She would wait for him to come home from the taverns, from the inns, from his club meetings. He would come home and work through the night. She would provide him bottomless cups of tea and only retire once he'd gone to bed, which could be around dawn. So yes, provided a certain sense of companionship. The rather more complicated relationship which comes up is that with Hester Thrale, later Piozzi. I'm sure there are people in the room, there's certainly people in the Johnson world who are far better positioned to talk about their relationship than myself. But in short, Hester Thrale was of a significant family. She was born around 1740 or 41, a Welsh diarist, author, socialite and patron of the arts, and an incredible source of information on Johnson and the 18th century more broadly through her publications. She belonged to the prominent Salisbury family, which was an Anglo-Welsh landowners, and at first she married a wealthy brewer, Henry Thrale. His Anchor Brewery used to sit on Southwark, where more or less the current Globe Theatre stands now. She and he had 12 children. I believe only 4 made it to adulthood. She later then married a teacher, a violinist, a music teacher, Gabriele Mario Piozzi. Her anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson, published 2 years after he passed away, and her diary Thraliana, which was published much later, only in 1942, are the main works for which she's remembered today. But she also wrote a popular history book, a travel book around Italy. She even wrote a dictionary, quite relevant to our work, British Synonym, or an attempt at regulating the choice of words in familiar conversation was its title, and that was published 10 years after Johnson's death in 1794. Her relationship with Johnson is well documented by herself, by other biographers, by the many letters that still remain, and it was very complicated. In 1765, the Thrales, Henry and Hester, were introduced to Samuel Johnson. This is 10 years after the publication of the dictionary. He was a famous literary man by this point. Thereafter, he spent a great deal of time in their home in Streatham, where he enjoyed lively conversation of his very well-educated hostess. Hester was very well-educated, very literary, very bright, and very keen to be in the literary circles here in 18th century London. It was widely speculated that the two would perhaps marry when Thrale died in 1781. But they had become estranged shortly after when Hester chose to marry the musician, the Catholic musician, effectively a servant, someone considered much below her in social status, Piozzi. And that was in July of 1784. So that's only 6 months before Johnson actually passes away. Her anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson, published, as I said, 2 years later, sold out within a day. And they do still remain one of the best personal accounts of Johnson. You get to see a sense of the man, the character, the conversation, his habits, his interests, his enormous affection for her children. He never had children of his own, but we see in his relationship with Barbara, with other children, he makes an excellent godfather. The writer Hannah More, one of the Blue Stockings group, considered the style to be quite anecdotal, but it certainly foreshadowed this new fashion biography, which Boswell would then excel at, the very anecdotal, the very personal, the very conversational, the vivacity with which language can bring somebody to life on page. That brings us quite a good segue to the Blue Stockings. But before I move on, I'm often asked about Hester Thrale and Johnson's relationship. Was it romantic? Did Johnson want to marry her? You will ask 20 Johnsonians that question and probably get 20 different answers. It is complex. I imagine that he was incredibly flattered by a lot of attention given by quite a beautiful, very well-educated, bright young woman who he could enjoy talking to. I think he became quite dependent on that affection and the open door policy to her much more comfortable home and the literary circle that she would host. She was a great literary hostess, and was devastated when that relationship suddenly ended and he was adrift of that world, of her companionship. Did he want to marry her? I don't think so, but there's others that would tell you that they did. Others have suggested a sexual relationship between the two, which I don't concur with, but I'm not the absolute leading authority, I shall say. So do go away and read if you're interested in that. I can give you some recommendations. The Blue Stockings, an entire group of women with Johnson absolutely adored and admired and respected and furthered the work of, in print as well as in person. This includes the likes of Elizabeth Montagu, Elizabeth Carter, Elizabeth Facey. There's lots of Elizabeths in our talk today. Group of very educated, intellectual women, consciously intellectually. They were effectively formed a group called the 18th Century Blue Stockings, led primarily by the hostess Elizabeth Montagu, the Queen of the Blues, she would be known as. Hester Chapone in many of this, and Carter would be the great respected classicist, of whom Johnson said her knowledge of ancient Greek was superior to anyone he had ever met. And this is at a time when Greek would be a very typical education for men, certainly men within the clergy. And she surpassed even, I think it was the Bishop of Oxford, in her knowledge of Greek at the dinner table and his own. And that is not a compliment he would likely give to anybody of any gender. Frances Burney was a younger member of this group, and he hugely admired her work too. Evelina was her first novel written. I think it was around the time Johnson was living here or just after, and it was published anonymously. And Johnson actually went round with a copy to his dear friend Charles Burney's house and said, "Good God, man, you have to read this." And later found out, well, he said, "Let me introduce you to the author." Johnson was absolutely delighted by this. And down comes the young Frances Burney. And he was floored by this, but in great admiration. Charlotte Lennox was one of these other intellectual women which Johnson adored and admired hugely. She was a Scottish author, a literary and cultural critic, perhaps famous now for the female Quixote that she wrote in 1752. And Joshua Reynolds took a portrait of her. She's featured in the 9 Living Muses of Great Britain that came out in 1778. Johnson declared her superior to all other female writers. Again, this is quite applauded. Henry Fielding said that she excelled even Cervantes himself. And her pioneering study of the source material used by Shakespeare in his plays is still cited to this day by Shakespeare scholars. A special mention goes out to, by special request by someone in our audience actually, to Molly Aston. Now, Molly Aston I would never have thought to include in this talk, but she deserves a special mention. A friend of Johnson's in his early years, 1706 to 1775 were her years. This is a woman about whom Johnson said that the happiest part of his life was the year in which he spent one whole evening with Molly Aston. We are not to know exactly what took place that evening. It was not happiness, but rapture, he says. This took place at some point in the early 1730s, so before his marriage to Tetty, for anyone who's wondering. So there are many, many significant women in Johnson's life. Obviously, love goes far beyond familial, romantic, even platonic. It goes to respect, and there are many male people in Johnson's circle of friends whom he would declare he loved, such as David Garrick, about whom he could be often quite critical himself, but never ever would tolerate a word said against in his company. The same would be true really of Joshua Reynolds, and of course the relationship with James Boswell was to a degree quite paternal. Certainly he permitted Boswell into his inner sanctum in a way that no other really was. Which led to that wonderful biography we have that looks behind the curtain. It looks behind the great works of a writer and his achievements to the actual, the foibles of the man himself. Francis Barber is another one of great significance in Johnson's life. He loved dearly from pretty much the day he met. He arrived here as a 10-year-old boy. Johnson, having no children of his own, having just lost his wife, living in this house alone, never having had servants, took a great liking to him, a great fondness to him, invested a huge amount of time and energy into teaching him how to read and write English, Latin, Greek, and a number of other languages. Whether Barber wanted to or not is quite a different question, but there is a remarkable survival of a manuscript. It's actually a manuscript of the dictionary, but on the reverse, Barber's handwriting. He's practicing spelling his name. He's practicing spelling England. And that would have been written to, it's a deduction, but I think with fair certainty in this very room. And his relationship with Barber would last for the rest of his life. It would be Barber that would be standing by Johnson's bedside when he passed away. And it was Barber who was named as the sole heir in his family, in his will. And with Barber, he could look after his family, his 2 sons, one of which was called Samuel after Johnson, and with which he could go open the school to become the first black schoolmaster in this country, which I think is an achievement Johnson, had he known this would happen, would have been extraordinarily proud of. But I'm going to turn to the dictionary now. to look at that question we first raised as to how on earth do you define love? And I'm going to throw it open to the audience here. First question would be anyone brave enough who wants to define it? Oh, yes, please, sir. A pleasant emotion. Oh, very good. Yes, yes. Okay. Yeah.
An uncontrollable emotion.
Uncontrollable emotion. Yes, yes. Okay. So at times perhaps less than pleasing, depending on whether it was unrequited or not, perhaps. Yes. Okay. How many distinct types of love do you think you could come up with, or by segue, definitions? What distinct classifications of love? Yes, I can see some of you thinking, okay, well, this guy. To cut that short, I can tell you about Johnson rather than my own thoughts on that matter, which is he came up with 14 distinct definitions for love, which we will review in brief here. So, first of all, absolutely number one is the passion between the sexes. So I think a physical act of love, an emotional one too. So while he cites 10 citations for this. So not only does he just give the one definition, he's usually giving one citation to support that definition in the dictionary, occasionally a couple to highlight the context and better exemplify for the reader what it means. 10 citations he gives for this first definition of love. Shakespeare, Milton, Dryden, Pope, the greats are up there. I've chosen one for today's talk from Shakespeare. It says, "While idly I stood looking on, I found the effect of love in idleness." In terms of Johnson, I'm going to try pull in some of what Johnson said in relation to love in this particular definition as we go through. So Boswell and he are cited as having a conversation in Boswell's biography. And this is Boswell. He says, "I still insisted that admiration was more pleasing than judgment, as love is more pleasing than friendship. The feeling of friendship is like that of being comfortably filled with roast beef. Love, like being enlivened with champagne." Now that's wonderful. That's Boswell speaking. That's wonderful, isn't it? Johnson says, "No, sir. Admiration and love are like being intoxicated with champagne. Judgment and friendship are like being enlivened." So there's that sense of intoxication. The second definition that he gives us is kindness, goodwill, friendship. So less amorous and more platonic. "By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." You'll probably recognise I'm citing the Bible there. Johnson gives us John, the chapter of John, verse 13. Sorry, chapter 13 of John. Johnson himself would touch upon this when he was writing his Rambler essays, the magazine that he was compiling alongside writing the dictionary in this room, in large part just to have cash at the end of the week to pay his bills, to feed the growing number of people in his household. He says in Rambler 99, written in 1751, "To love all men is our duty, so far as it includes a general habit of benevolence, a readiness of occasional kindness, but to love all is equally impossible." So to love all equally in the same degree is impossible. His third definition goes on, it simply just says courtship. "Demetrius made love to Nidar's daughter Helena and won her soul." This is Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream. In terms of Johnson and his relationship to courtship, he doesn't talk about this a great deal, but he did describe his marriage to Tetty, as I mentioned before, as a love match on both sides, the love match being the courtship and the emotion between them. The fourth definition is the one that we touched upon at the beginning of the talk, is tenderness, parental care. "No religion that ever was so fully represents the goodness of God and his tender love to mankind, which is the most powerful argument to the love of God," says Tillotson in the dictionary. I couldn't quite find anything on Johnson about parental love. I mean, he's not a parent himself and he had a complicated relationship with his parents. So I've slightly gone off piste here and cited the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography on Johnson. And this says, the author of this entry, that later in life her son respected her memory. I cited this before, but gave little sign that he enjoyed a warm or loving relationship with his mother. So very respectful, but perhaps slightly restrained. Fifth definition is liking, an inclination to. As an example, the love of one's country. So Fenton here is cited saying, in youth of patrimonial wealth possessed, the love of science faintly warmed his breast. So the love of knowledge, the love of a concept, the love of an ideal is certainly something Johnson could relate to. He wrote about this in The Idler, number 39. This was written in 1759, so one of the last things that he would write in this house shortly before Rasselas. The joy of life is variety. The inclination to love must be rekindled by intervals of absence. So to agree, talking about absence making the heart grow fonder, perhaps. Number 6, we have an object loved. So a treasured item of sorts. He quotes Dryden here, the banished never hopes his love to see. Again, I struggled trying to find a citation for Johnson on this, so I would welcome one if anyone knows of one. But I'm going to swiftly move on to number 7, which is lewdness. Shakespeare is cited here, Richard III. He is not lolling on a lewd love bed, but on his knees at meditation in prayer. So very good, very laudable. Again, Johnson not cited talking about lewd love very much, but there is an anecdote which gets sort of bandied about humorously quite often, and I think for the purposes of our talk, we'll bring Johnson into the act of lewdness briefly. So this is Johnson to David Garrick at the Drury Lane Theatre, as quoted by Boswell. Johnson says, "I'll come no more behind your scenes, David, for the silk stockings and the white bosoms of your actresses excite my amorous propensities." So that's about as lewd as Johnson ever gets. And apparently that is a slightly censored version of what was actually said. This is Boswell slightly polishing Johnson's vulgarity on such a moment. Number 8, moving swiftly on, unreasonable liking. Men in love with their opinions may not only suppose what is in question, but allege wrong matter of fact. This is Locke cited here, so quite philosophical, but I reckon there's a number of politicians one could think of immediately in which that may apply. Moving swiftly onwards, Rambler essay, number 18, written in this house, 1752. This is something you may have seen in the marketing for today. It says, Johnson says, "It is always necessary to be loved, but not always necessary to be reverenced." So, curious. One must feel love, but not necessarily respect. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I wondered if anyone had any opinions. Do say so during the comments at the end of the talk. We have here number 9, fondness, concord. So Shakespeare again featuring here says, "Come love and health to all, then I'll sit down. Give me some wine, fill full." So they're making a toast. Rambler essay again, written here in 1751. Johnson here talks about heroic generosity or philosophical discoveries may compel veneration and respect. But love always implies some kind of natural or voluntary equality. So not necessarily a respect, but some natural act. Number 10, he defines love as a principle of union. He's quoting South here. He says, "Love is the great instrument of nature, the bond and cement of society, the spirit and spring of the universe. Love is such an affection as cannot so properly be said to be in the soul, as the soul to be in love. It is the whole man wrapped up into one desire." So that kind of sense, I think one of you said that inescapable compulsion to love. Johnson, rather curiously, writes a lot about marriage, actually, not necessarily about his own, but about the concept, the value of it, the importance of it to society. It is commonly a weak man who marries for love, he's known to have said at some point. But yet he talks of himself marrying Tetty very much so for love. So whether he had any inner conflict, I suppose we will not know. Number 11, moving onwards, picturesque representation of love. So some sort of visual imagery. He quotes Dryden's translation of Ovid here. "The lovely babe was born with every grace. Such was his form as painters when they show their utmost art or naked loves bestow." As in sort of the nudes that they may paint in art. Again, slightly tricky thinking of Johnson and pictures of love, but there's a citation from the Idler. So this is written again around the time he left this house in 1759, Idler 39. He says, the image on a bracelet of a husband, so some sort of little love token, the image of a bracelet of a husband encircled with diamonds and rubies may gain some esteem, but will never excite love. He goes to sort of on to explain that if love is not real in presence, no number of gifts is going to actually compel someone to love you. Number 12, simply a word of endearment. And I think this is very much something used to this day. It says, "'Tis no dishonour, trust me, my love, 'tis none. I would die for thee." This is Dryden's Don Sebastian. And I'm going to quote now the letter I mentioned in the talk from Johnson to Tetty, that sole surviving letter from the 31st of January 1740. He concludes, sort of, "Be assured, my dear girl, that I have seen nobody in these rambles upon which I have been forced, and that has not contributed to confirm my esteem and affection for thee." I quoted that earlier. He signs off on this letter saying, "I am, my charming love, yours, Samuel Johnson." So you really do get a sense of that affection that he had for her. The 13th definition is due reverence to God, specifically. Again, he's quoting John from the Bible here. He says, "I know that you have not the love of God in you." Johnson wrote a poem. I'm not quite sure of the date of it, but he's cited here saying, "Life of ages richly poured, love of God unspent and free, flowing in the prophet's word and in the people's liberty." A love of God is something that would absolutely impact Johnson's life. The early years embedded from his mother's lessons absolutely stayed with him. And even on his deathbed, it brought him great comfort to hear that he would be buried in the greatest place of religion in his mind, Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner, where you can visit him to this day. Pay your own reverence. The final 14th definition is not one I had heard of before consulting Johnson's dictionary. Again, I'll throw the floor open to anyone who may know. This he defines as a kind of thin silk stuff. So a material called love. He quotes Boyle on colours, this essay on colours. He says, "This leaf held near the eye and observed to the light appeared so full of pores, with such a transparency as that of a sieve, a piece of cypress, or a love hood." So some very thin, sort of silky fabric. So those are 14 definitions of Johnson, and where possible, sort of relevant citations from Johnson's own writing. I just wanted to conclude with the wealth that is in this dictionary on the word love. So beyond the 14 definitions of love itself, there are a further 19 related love words. Some of these might be familiar to us today, such as lovelorn, he describes as being forsaken of love. Lovesick, which we can relate to perhaps on occasions, he describes as a disorder of love. He goes on to such tokens such as a love knot, a little gift, a love thought, which is when you're sort of daydreaming about your loved one, a love toy, a little gift, and even a love trick, which is quite a nice little sort of token. And one of the more curious ones, a love monger. Yes, now what on earth is a love monger? I know the definition of it, and I'm still not quite sure what it is. He describes it as one who deals in affairs of love. So this could be sort of a concept of sort of love poetry, a poet who's writing about love, rather more salaciously. Is it sort of a pimp? I don't know. So I will leave that to your conclusions. The dictionary is very much here for you to look at. I've helpfully opened it. You probably saw me scribbling some notes down furiously before the lecture. You can leaf through that at your leisure. The dictionary is actually also available in full in digital form online. If you simply Google Samuel Johnson Dictionary online, you will find it. And every single definition, as per the first edition, will be there for you. So you just type in your love word, whatever word search it is, and up will pop everything Johnson has had to say in his great dictionary from the comfort of your own home. I'm happy to open the field to any questions. It was a sort of an overview of Johnson's experience with love in various forms and his definitions. But I'd be very keen to hear your own thoughts, responses, as well as any questions. Oh, yes, you've got one.
Did Johnson necessarily think about love transitioning from one type of love to another?
That's a very good question. I think he does write about that. I wouldn't be able to cite it to you now. I could try and get back to you on that. But in marriage, because he writes a lot about marriage, and he talks about, the folly of marrying for love, actually, versus the sensible approach of marrying for within one's social class, actually, to avoid conflict and to ensure your estate continues should you be of the wealthier classes. Thank you. He also talks rather uncomfortably for a modern audience, certainly myself, about infidelity within marriage. So the passions of the courtship and the honeymoon. Honeymoon is a word that is in the dictionary as we would understand it to be. And how that shifts over time into more of a pragmatic cohabitation. And if you're able to tolerate each other, then that probably after a number of years is a real sign of genuine love rather than impassioned love. But yes, he talks about the infidelity I mentioned as being pretty despicable on both sides, men and women, but a far greater sin if a woman commits it because of the sheer question of paternity of any children that may result. So, not an enlightened idea, rather ancient one, but I suppose of legal concern. Yes.
We know that Boswell and Johnson and so on frequented taverns and coffee houses, as you mentioned. I'm rather assuming women didn't at the time. So my question is, what were the conventions about men and women who were unmarried to each other meeting?
Yes, that is a question. Very interesting. I think there are others better positioned to answer that than me, but as a broad strokes answer, I would say it very much depends on social class, especially where there's a dowry involved, where there's a certain social status involved. You would want to marry within certain respectable families. You, at the lower end of the social class, say if you're servants, you would probably meet people at work, in the street, in the course of your daily life, and that may lead to more of a love match and less concern about inheritance and the protection of it or of land. In terms of taverns and inns, very broadly speaking, again, I think for the most part women weren't found there, but they would be working there. Socially speaking, again, I think London versus the countryside would be quite different. And there were certainly taverns or inns of a certain reputation where women would frequent, but men would need to take extra money with them for the pleasure of that, I expect, yes. You've also got things like Vauxhall Gardens, which, depending on the time of day that you were there and depending on the part of the park you were in, could be very respectable. One would want to be seen at such places, and one would want a degree of privacy in other parts of the park. Boswell and his act of love, the lewdness, would have a great deal more experience than Johnson in that respect, having ultimately died of syphilis. Yes. Any other comments or questions? Oh, well, then, on that note, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming out in the dull weather and enjoy the dictionary. Thank you. Thank you.